Good afternoon. My name is Veronika Grishenko and I'm Open World Program Coordinator here in Ukraine. And today our guest is Mr. Vільямом Сізом, who is the Chief of Party of Competitive Economy Program in Ukraine. So, Mr. Sізom, could you please tell us more about the program itself and what are the main objectives of it?
First of all, thank you for having me, Veronica, and please call me Bill.
Sure.
The program is a $42 million commitment by the United States Agency for International Development to continue to foster Ukraine's economic competitiveness. I mean, the broad responsibilities are simply to engage, support the private sector to be more competitive both domestically and international markets. We have about a 5-year runtime, and it was originally initiated in October of 2018.
Okay, so and the target audience of the program is?
Target audience of the program is small and medium enterprises. So Ukraine has a unique economy. Around the world, particularly in the US and Europe, SMEs represent a larger percentage of gross domestic products. So for example, over 90% of the companies in this country are SMEs, yet they represent less than 20% of the gross domestic product. If you were to look at other countries like the EU, SMEs represent at least 40 to 50% overall gross domestic product. In the US, it's probably around 40 to 50%. So CEP has a nationwide footprint to support SMEs or small and medium enterprises to be more competitive, to be a larger part of the economy of Ukraine.
Could you please tell in more details about the different directions that program has? Because I know there is a special grant for female entrepreneurs and also there is different social programs.
Yeah, the program is big and complex. We have a lot of initiatives. I tend to look at things in terms of whether or not we're doing transactional work or transformative work. So for example, we take a lot of companies to trade fairs, or we look for ways to provide immediate benefits. When I think about transactional, I think, what can we do to support SMEs in the near term to drive their ability to be more successful? On the transformative work, we think about that over a longer period of time. What are we doing to provide enduring benefits to the Ukrainian economy to be more competitive in world markets?
Could you please tell us more about how you support female entrepreneurs in Ukraine?
Sure. One of the things that we've done, a part of the program, is look at women entrepreneurship and recognize that they were not getting as much support more broadly. So we created a boot camp for women entrepreneurs, both those that have an idea about supporting their business and those that have actually built businesses already but needed a little additional support. So those boot camps run for about a week. They had been in person, but of course the external crisis had caused us to pivot to be online. But it's probably one of the most inspiring parts of my job is I've had an opportunity to both open every boot camp and close every boot camp and see the enormous excitement amongst young entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs, that are building and driving businesses under the toughest conditions. So it actually has been probably one of the most rewarding times for me on a day-to-day basis.
So how many boot camps have you done so far?
I believe it has been 6 boot camps, a combination of both
That's
in-person and remote, specifically for women. And the good news is that it's a combination of women that have just ideas at this point, and it also includes women that have built their businesses, and I have the good fortune of being able to support them personally because they're selling products that I love, chocolate being one of them. And we also have an opportunity as a project to sort of help them expand their enterprises by making people more aware of the products and services that they're offering.
Okay, so female entrepreneurship is definitely having a future in Ukraine, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the empirical evidence, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the participation of women in the economy drive economic growth. And part of the goal is to make sure that those opportunities are being created for the women.
Wonderful. I also know that the program has its own business incubator, and what kind of startups are usually participating in the events of this business incubator?
So that's true. So the Ukrainian economy is known for its outsourcing, the competitiveness of its outsourcing. So much so that, frankly, they're short of resources for all the demand, and you see the articles about tech people leaving to other countries where they think there's higher salaries. But by and large, in my time here, what we recognized and what people before me recognized is that there's a lot of innovation here, an extraordinary amount of talented people with ideas and innovations. The problem is that it can't be commercialized. They have the technical know-how, but they don't know how to bring that to market. So if I create something but I can't sell it, it's not of as much value. So part of the role of the incubator is to support these teams, these new entrepreneurs, in commercializing their tech by essentially bringing them knowledge from international mentors. We provide opportunities for access to capital by bringing international investors. And then we also introduce them to other parties that they're going to need support for, whether it be lawyers or accountants, that need to run their business. So it's a fairly intensive program. It lasts for 4 months. It starts with a boot camp in the first week, and then runs for 4 months for Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays and nights. And then oftentimes they have to work on Saturdays. But it is an intensive program meant to prepare them not just to compete in Ukraine, but to compete internationally. And so the overarching goal continues to be, how do we take some of the bright ideas and the energy that's pent up and bring it to market so that the value can stay in Ukraine?
So basically, the main issue for Ukrainian startups is not only marketing itself, but also it's a question of investments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Access to finance is fundamental to any functioning economy, and it certainly represents a challenge not just for startup businesses, for any businesses in Ukraine. We are involved in some various access to finance initiatives. As it relates to the incubators, the overarching goal is to introduce them to, again, domestic investors as well as international investors. And not all of them will be able to compete for that type of investment, but the goal is to pick those companies that are energized and have products and services that are unique that can actually be commercialized and brought to market. We have some other access to finance initiatives that we're trying to support for small and medium enterprises. So for example, the public procurement process of the Ukrainian government. A lot of SMEs aren't able to participate or choose not to participate because the various agencies that procure chairs or tables or whatever, they often have payment terms that aren't helpful to SMEs. So if an SME is selling chairs, for example, and wants to bid on an opportunity for the government that wants to buy chairs, they need to be paid in a reasonable amount of time in order to produce it and or continue to produce more and operate. But more often than not, those payment terms come with some ambiguity. They're not sure if they're going to be paid. So we've worked with SMEDO, the government, to create an online factoring platform. And what that means in layman's terms is, if I happen to be an SME and I win an opportunity to provide the government or one of its agencies chairs, for example, I can actually collect that receivable from the government through the banking system much more quickly than I could if I waited for the agency to pay me. So it's a little bit more complicated, but factoring is a contemporary use of finance for the last 40 years around the world. Ukraine has an underdeveloped market, and we're taking advantage of the opportunity to bring more SMEs into the public procurement process so that they can compete and that they can also access some of the financing they need to run their business.
And so, as you said, the program is already working in Ukraine since 2018. So let's talk about any success stories that you already have. Do you have any accomplishments so far?
Yeah, there are a few. If we go back to what I said about sort of the way I look at things and the way we should be looking at things is transactional versus transformational. Some of the transactional activities are really about identifying companies that we already know can compete in international markets. So for example, we brought a number of companies to Startup Grind in Silicon Valley. We brought a number of companies to London Tech Week. We brought them to Portugal. We brought them to Norway, where we identify a group of companies that we know have the capabilities and have the products and their services that can compete in the international markets, but may not necessarily have the resources to get there or identify buyers. So we try to sort of bridge that gap. And we've done a lot of that transactional work that has resulted in the types of outcomes that we want, which is increasing sales of companies that we're working with. The transformational work takes a little longer. Those are activities, we're about 20 months into the program. Some of the early initiatives that we undertook are now coming to bear fruit, which is fantastic. One of the key partnerships that we have multiple partnerships with the government, and we've had an effective working relationship with a number of agencies within the Ukrainian government. But for example, we've worked with the state privatization agency, which handles privatization for Ukraine. One of the things that they wanted to do under their new leadership is make sure that they could privatize a lot of the state-owned assets more effectively than they have been able to do in the past. So this is a rare combination where our transactional work and our transformational work comes together. So the transformational work started with preparing the state property fund to have a more efficient process. So we brought in consultants, international consultants, that worked with them to refine their entire privatization process from day one all the way to sale by creating transparent systems that allowed investors from Ukraine and around the world to see the assets. And the technical term is we created a virtual data room that allows international investors without ever coming to Ukraine to see what's available for sale. That's an important part of what it takes to attract investors, which is transparency. And that had largely been absent in the history of privatization in Ukraine. The transactional part is, if you're familiar, the Dnipro Hotel, which received a lot of publicity, was recently put up for privatization. The CEP program worked with the State Property Fund to conduct the due diligence. We hired third-party expertise to conduct the due diligence that investors would be able to see online so that they understood that, again, the process was transparent. So we supported the State Property Fund's ability to provide this information to international investors and domestic investors so that they could see that this was done in a legally compliant, transparent way, and that contributes to a lot of things. It contributes to investor interest to come to Ukraine. It dismisses some of the notions that of corruption, and it adds value. So that process gives investors more confidence when they're bidding and presumably would raise the price. And as you know, that was a very successful privatization, and we're optimistic that that will ultimately close and be the start of a bright future in terms of future privatizations for the country.
Actually, privatization of Hotel Dnipro was a good example of fruitful cooperation between you and Ukrainian government. And I would like to hear about some challenges that you might have working simultaneously with private and public sectors in Ukraine.
Well, I mean, look, the key to success in this program, or frankly in any of the programs that are run, is nurturing and building and nurturing these relationships. So, look, we parachute in. It's a brand new program. We have to establish credibility with our counterparts, both within the private sector and the public sector, that we're going to work together with them in a way that's going to achieve the results that they want and that we want, that are part of our contract. One of the challenges that sort of we faced is in the last 20 months, there's been a few transitions in sort of the government, leadership, whether it be Prime Minister or the head of MEDT. Some of those are critical or important relationships to us, and so it presents a challenge sometimes when there's changing faces. But by and large, the government has been cooperative, and we have a great relationship with a number of agencies within the government. I think the biggest challenge right now, frankly, is COVID. If you think about what this program is designed to do, which is support private sector competitiveness, there's no question that Ukraine has not been spared sort of the economic turmoil associated with the pandemic. So we started under the conditions that Ukraine had a growing economy, had a stable exchange rate, interest rates were coming down, and now we've entered a period where there's a contraction. So sectors that we work in have been particularly hard hit. While we focus on SMEs, we also focus on some specific sectors, including furniture, food processing, the film industry more recently, and then we're also looking, of course, at IT and some regional tourism. So if you step back and you look at the consequences of the crisis, international tourism has come to a halt. The furniture manufacturers who may have had markets in Europe or Russia over the last 2 years, those have been changed. Supply chains have been altered. So right now, the overarching goal remains the same: is how do we drive competitiveness? But now how do we look at this external crisis and provide some different support that allow companies, one, to survive, and secondly, find new markets so they can generate sales and or find new investment.
Take into account that you have been working in so many countries all over the world, and what kind of amendments should happen to Ukrainian legislation in order to boost our country's economy?
Well, I can't recommend specific legislation. I know that it's easy to just list a bunch of laws that you pass. So there's a difference between passing legislation and the implementation of it. So one of the challenges that I think we face is we as a program want to support efforts by the national government and the subnational government to create an environment, one, that's more stable. Secondly, it's not changing all the time, and that just creates a better environment for businesses to be more successful, what I call lowering the friction costs of doing business. So, I've been here over 2 years. I've traveled throughout the world for the last 20, and it's not my first time in Ukraine. I had been here 10 years ago. Friction costs erode the profitability of small firms, and there is a lot of friction cost here. So we have focused on those areas where we feel that either administratively or legislatively changes and or amendments or the elimination of legislation would go a long way towards supporting the ability of these companies to be more effective. We ourselves as a program don't advocate directly to the government. We work with our counterparts, for instance, an association that knows that there's legislation that's impacting its particular industry. We might help them to support their position paper with the government to help them understand how a change might be helpful to both the government and to the industry. But we ourselves as a program don't advocate for specific changes in law. And of course, any country has to look at the stability of its judicial system. We don't work on that specifically, but of course that's always in the news for any country, because in order to attract international investment, you have to have a stable judicial system and or one that people believe is going to protect their rights. And secondly, you need to have a stable financial system. Both of those are underpinnings of any functioning and mature economy. And again, while we specifically aren't addressing those matters, we pay attention to what's evolving in those areas so that we understand what the constraints are.
So the program is going to work for the next 3 years for sure in Ukraine. And what is your strategy for the coming years?
Well, I think that the strategy will largely be the same. I think that we will continue to, I think there's a little bit more, we're presently in our work planning, sort of in year 3, kind of positioning how we want to focus in year 3. And I think given the external crisis of COVID, one of the areas that we're focusing is how do we drive more transactional work for the constituency we're serving? How do we help open up new markets? How do we make sure that their supply chains are reestablished so that they can make sales, right? If you're a small business anywhere in this country and you effectively weren't able to sell as much or anything over the last few months, your first priority was how do I sell things, right? Some percentage of businesses will not be able to reopen because they will not be able to they won't have the cash flow to have remained closed for such a long period of time. So I think we'll continue to dial in and focus on the transactional work that we need to undertake. And at the same time, we want to be opportunistic with the transformational work. One of the legacies of a project like this is how do we do things that we know won't necessarily be outputs in the years that we're here, but that fundamentally lay the foundation for success in the future. And we have to be comfortable in these programs with doing that. So we'll continue to engage in some of the transformational work that lay the foundation for this country and small and medium enterprises to be more competitive on the world stage. So that'll continue to be the focus of it. Our overarching goal continues to be, how do we drive sustainable sales? How do we lift the standard of living for the people that we're serving and or the country? And how do we create an environment where international investment wants to be here or increase domestic investment? But ultimately, our goal is to raise the standard of living of the stakeholders we're serving.
Thank you, Bill, for the conversation. It was wonderful to have you here at our office today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, dear audience. And we will meet with Mr. Vільямом Сізом once again because we will do a separate event on corporate culture. So see you soon and goodbye.